One of the most frequently asked questions I get, especially from people new to bodybuilding, is what did the bodybuilders use in the past in the way of food supplements? I mean, today you look in the bodybuilding magazines, you go online, there's just this plethora, this just amazing amount of food supplements being sold for just about every purpose. And people wonder, what did the bodybuilders back in the 60s and 70s use, since a lot of these supplements were not available back then? Did they use supplements extensively, or did they depend on diet? What exactly was let's say, the usual practice of bodybuilders in the late 60s and early 70s? Since I was around in those days, and since I was competing back then, I can pretty well answer the question. I also knew of the supplement and diet practices of most of the top bodybuilders of the early 70s, such as Arnold Schwarzenegger and many others. So I think I'm in a position to kind of talk about this. So let's talk about, focus on the supplements that were available. As I said, most of the top supplements that are available today were not available back then. One example, in a way, well, it's kind of ironic. In a way, it's whey, because whey protein actually was available. Whey protein has been available, believe it or not, since the early 30s, but it was not a popular supplement, and it wasn't even commercially available in the 70s. Because it just tasted bad and it looked bad. And when you put it in a blender, it actually blended green. I mean, it turned a lot of people off. So you didn't see whey supplements in the 70s. But what you did see is a pretty good amount of milk and egg supplements. Perhaps the most popular milk and egg supplement starting in the early 60s was called Blairs Protein. It was manufactured by a guy, named Rio H. Blair. His real name was Irvin Johnson. He was from Chicago, where he actually operated a gym, and then he got into the supplement business. He was kind of a self-proclaimed expert in nutrition, and he put together this milk and egg protein. The milk portion was basically, if I remember correctly, it was a kind of a caseinate type of milk protein, and the egg part was egg powder, or probably egg whites. Now, Blairs Protein was only 62% protein and was loaded with lactose. So, a lot of people who took it couldn't handle it, because if they were lactose intolerant, they'd get bloated and they'd get, flatulence and digestive problems. So some people couldn't take it. Blair would often recommend taking his milk and egg protein with heavy cream. He said the combination of milk and egg protein with heavy cream put tremendous amounts of mass on. Some of his let's say, more famous bodybuilding clients included Larry Scott, Don Haworth. A lot of the guys from Vince's gym in the mid-60s used Blair's product. Arnold Schwarzenegger used Blair's Protein when he first came over to the United States. The big feature about Blair's Protein, I can tell you, was its taste. Blair sold a coconut extract that you could add to the protein. Now, I actually used this. If you used, let's say, I don't remember how many scoops of Blair's I put in there, but if you put in the Blair's protein, and then you added you mixed it with heavy cream, and then you added this coconut extract, you mixed it, what happened was it would get so thick in the blender that it became like a pudding. It wasn't a drink anymore, it was a pudding. But the point being that it was incredibly delicious. I mean, to this day, seriously, I know this is hard to believe, I don't think I've ever tasted any ice cream that tasted as good as this Blair's Protein mixture of Blair's Protein, heavy cream, and coconut extract. I don't think Blair's Protein is sold anymore, and even if it is, I mean, at 62% protein and a very high lactose content, it's not really the best quality protein you want to use these days. There's a lot better proteins, like your typical whey protein isolate has very little lactose and causes very little digestive problems, although some people still get a little bloated from whey protein, which I think could be a slight milk allergy, because there's nothing else in whey that can cause a bloating effect. It's not really loaded with sodium or anything like that. So let's move on to, let's talk about a couple other protein supplements that were popular back in the 60s and 70s. Another one that was not as popular as the milk and egg protein was organ meat protein. I remember there was a famous bodybuilder named Chester Yorton. Chester Yorton won the IFBB Mr. America, I believe it was 1966. And that same year, at the NABA Miss Universe in London, he defeated a then upcoming bodybuilder, 20-year-old guy named Arnold Schwarzenegger. This was one of Arnold's only defeats in competition. He lost to this American Chet Yorton. Anyway, Chet Yorton developed his own organ meat protein. It actually wasn't that bad. It contained like liver, pancreas, organ meats. Whatever found in the internal organs was in this protein. It did not taste anywhere near as good as Blairs Protein, but it was fairly good quality protein. But like I say, the taste wasn't that great, so it didn't really catch on. And there was a couple of other organ meat proteins. One of them was called Malabar, which was also an organ meat. That had a kind of a rougher texture compared to Chet Yorton's protein. But, this was an alternative for people that didn't want to have any kind of milk and egg protein or couldn't tolerate milk and egg protein for whatever the reason. Another kind of protein that was wanted a long time, even before milk and egg, was the soy proteins, which were basically most popularized by Bob Hoffman and his York Barbell Company. He actually produced a number of soy products. And of course, soy protein is a vegetable protein. It's still around today. It's not, although the nutrition texts, a lot of them compare it to, as far as quality goes, to animal proteins such as milk and eggs using a certain scale called the PDDAC or something like that. But in truth, soy protein is not, as far from a muscle building or anabolic point of view, it's not comparable to, let's say, whey protein. And I'll tell you the reason for that is because, first of all, they've done head-to-head studies comparing whey and soy. In almost every study, whey proves superior. Now, soy has a little bit less content of branched-chain amino acids, but that's not the main problem. The main problem is what they found is when you ingest soy protein orally, most of it is taken up by the splanchnic organs or the internal organs. So a great deal of the soy protein you ingest orally is actually more used to kind of replace internal organ protein rather than muscle protein. So for that reason, the whey protein tends to be used more by muscles. So soy protein is still to this day quite inferior to animal protein such as whey or even egg protein. I wouldn't call it a bad protein. There's a lot of myths about soy protein. I'm going to be covering this in my Applied Metabolics newsletter. There's a lot of myths about soy protein, how it's going to cause gyno, how it's going to, raises estrogen, all this nonsense. Now, the best thing I can tell you about that is it's the old saying in pharmacology, only the dose determines the poison. If you ingest massive amounts of any soy protein or soy food, yeah, you're going to have an estrogenic effect in males. That's true. But if you take normal amounts like a scoop a day or maybe a scoop a day, 25 grams of soy protein, it's not going to cause any side effects, not going to cause any estrogen effects. It's not going to interfere with your thyroid. All of that's bullshit, to put it bluntly. But again, I still think that soy, in my opinion, because of its kind of uptake by the splanchnic or internal organs compared to muscles, is inferior to whey. Some of the others, then they had egg protein. Egg protein's been around. This usually, the earlier egg proteins that were around in the 70s, unfortunately, they were kind of over-processed. So what this meant was they were kind of heated, and a lot of the amino acids contained in the product underwent a process called denaturization, which basically resulted in the destruction of a lot of the essential amino acids that are needed to build muscle. But back then, you have to understand, egg protein was the king of proteins. It was considered the best protein. It was the number one on everybody's list. So even the egg proteins that had the slightly denatured amino acids still were a pretty good product. Of course, egg proteins continued to rule as the king of protein supplements until whey became more popular in the early 90s, and then eggs were pushed aside, egg protein. But however, egg protein is still available today. And I've said this before, I'll just add this in real fast. If you prefer to get your eggs from egg protein from real eggs, don't throw away the yolk. Don't believe all the misinformation about how bad yolks are and they contain all this fat and all this and that nonsense. Half the protein in an egg is in the yolk, half is in the white, and together, what the protein of the egg and the yolk, that's what constitutes the ideal amino acid balance of eggs. So if you don't eat the yolk, and you get the white and you don't eat the white, yeah, you're getting almost pure protein, but you're not getting the ideal balance of amino acids. It's not that great a protein anymore, contrary to what anyone might believe. So I strongly recommend that you, and by the way, most of the nutrients, as I've said in past videos, are all in the yolk. And just about all the nutrients are in the yolk. It's just plain stupid to throw away egg yolks. And this idea of let's say, eating 4 egg whites and throwing in one yolk, that's better, but that's still kind of stupid. Why would you throw away all those nutrients? It doesn't make any sense. Completely senseless. I know a lot of you guys won't believe me, but I'm just telling you the truth based on science. So you can do whatever you want. Anyway, the next one, a couple of supplements that I took. I remember when I was a kid, I started out working out regularly when I was 12 years old, and at 12 years old, you don't know a lot about supplements. And I remember going to a supermarket and I looked on the shelf that had this stuff called wheat germ. And I looked at it and it had a pretty good amount of protein, and I had vitamin E. It had a good amount of vitamin. And so my very first supplement was actually wheat germ. I used to mix it in with my cereal in the morning. I'd eat like oatmeal and put a couple of tablespoons of wheat germ, and I bought the wheat germ that didn't contain sugar. I was smart enough even back then to know that you don't want to add extra sugar to the product. I also used a supplement that was actually pretty popular back then. You don't hear about it much these days. It was called Brewers Yeast. And Brewers Yeast, the features of Brewers Yeast were that it was high in the B-complex vitamins. But the thing that was unique about Brewers Yeast was that it contained what was then called the glucose tolerance factor. In other words, scientists knew there was something in Brewers Yeast that helped you control glucose levels, also modulated insulin levels in the body, but they weren't sure what it was, so they called it the glucose tolerance factor. Well, it turned out that the glucose tolerance factor turned out to be a complex of the trace mineral chromium. And to this day, Brewers yeast is still probably the best natural source of chromium. It contains more chromium, I think, than any other food. Cheese has a little bit of chromium too. So I used Brewers yeast. Tasted awful. It tasted terrible. I used to mix it in with the drinks. Oh, it was terrible. In fact, speaking of terrible tasting drinks, there was another protein I used, also made by Hoffman's York Barbell Company. Some of you older guys might remember this. It was called Protein from the Sea. Protein from the Sea. And it had a texture. It was aptly named because it had a texture exactly like beach sand, and it tasted like dead fish scales. And I used to get a kick out of giving it to my people. People would see me taking it and want to try it. And if I was in a kind of funny mood, I wouldn't warn them. I would just hand them the drink. And it was funny to see most of them would gag, and one or two of them even vomited after taking a couple of drinks of this protein from the sea. It was almost impossible to disguise the dead fish flavor of this stuff. I still to this day don't know what kind of fish was used in this, but it was probably rotting fish, judging by the smell and taste of it. It never really achieved much popularity for obvious reasons. Of course, then they had, another one I certainly can't leave out, desiccated liver. Desiccated liver. Desiccated means dry. Desiccated liver is a dehydrated liver product where they take liver and they remove all the water and they turn it into either a powder or a tablet. And I could tell you that in the 60s and 70s, desiccated liver was probably the king of bodybuilding supplements. Just about everybody who competed in bodybuilding took desiccated liver back then. Vince Garanda, who I just wrote a huge article in my Applied Metabolics newsletter about Vince's nutrition and training principles. Vince Garanda was a huge advocate of desiccated liver. In fact, he used to advise bodybuilders to take, I think it was 2 to 3 liver tablets every 2 hours. And it would work. He claimed it would work like steroids. I think that was a little bit of hyperbole, but his reasoning was that taking liver tablets every 2 hours would maintain a high nitrogen balance in the blood, which would stimulate muscle protein synthesis. Unfortunately, Vince wasn't aware of research that was published many years later showing that muscle protein synthesis peaks in about 90 minutes. In other words, after 90 minutes of whatever source of protein you eat, the muscle protein synthesis just stops. So, taking a supplement like desiccated liver every 2 hours is maybe going to work for the first two times you use it, and after that, it's not going to do anything but give you a lot of gas, which was the problem with desiccated liver. I mean, the usual dosage of desiccated liver tablets, I think they were 10-grain tablets, if I remember correctly, would the dose used by the bodybuilders back then, before a well, it averaged about 50 tablets a day. We didn't take 50 all at once. We'd space them out, maybe take 10 at a time. But up to before a contest, many of us, including me, I tried this, took 100 liver tablets a day, 100. And I can tell you that the extent of farts and gas that you got from this stuff was just was too much. It was almost intolerable. I mean, it was just too much. But there's a scientific reason why you wouldn't want to take that much desiccated liver. Desiccated liver, it has pretty good protein in it. It has B-complex vitamins. It also contains a good amount of iron. And what they found in the last couple of years that ingesting iron, a lot of iron, is not a good thing for men, because iron, it's normally carried in the blood attached to a protein called ferritin. But if it's disassociated from ferritin, in other words, if it becomes free iron, it becomes very reactive. In other words, it could start reacting with creating what they call free radicals, or reactive oxygen species. These things attack cell membranes. And there are some studies that link high free iron levels with the onset of cardiovascular disease and even cancer. And in the brain, it's linked to the onset of degenerative brain disease, including Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's. So I don't think it's a good idea to take a lot of iron. And again, if you consume a lot of liver tablets, to the extent, let's say 50, 100 a day, you're getting a huge amount of iron. So I don't recommend that at all. But you have to understand, back then, we didn't know all this. Even the scientists didn't know all this. Everything I've just told you was discovered in, let's say, the last 20 years. Nobody knew what I just told you back then. So we were basically, you could say we were going on blind faith, if you want to call it that. None of us ever really got sick, other than minor side effects, like I say, intestinal gas and that kind of stuff. You had to kind of you had to be careful in social situations. Of course, I discovered activated charcoal, which absorbs gas. That helped a lot. You might want to keep around some today if you have a gas problem. Activated charcoal. It also absorbs poisons. So what else can I say? Oh, we also took some vitamins, vitamin C, vitamin E. They were around back then. We took them too. But that was about it. As far as the diets goes, there was nothing special about the diets. Ate normal food. The emphasis was always on protein, especially meat and eggs. Arnold ate meat and eggs and a little bit of vegetables. And that's the way it was. We had off days. Before a contest, we'd stay on a diet, let's say 6 days a week. And maybe on Sundays, we'd have what they call a junk day, where we'd eat whatever we want. And I could tell you a funny story. I remember I was training for a contest, and I was on a very low-carb diet 6 days a week. My junk day was Sunday. Me and a bunch of the guys from Gold's Gym went to a buffet, they called it, a smorgasbord. It was in Santa Monica. And there was a sign on the outside that said, all you can eat. In other words, you'd pay a certain amount. They'd have this buffet set up with one group was vegetables, the other group was meats, like beef, roast beef, whatever they had, turkey, whatever they had that day. I would go there and I'd skip the vegetables, and I'd load up on the beef. I'd pile this meat on my plate, would be like a foot high, and I'd go up. I was starving on those. I mean, by the time the 6th day came, I was hungry, So I would just load up on this meat at the buffet. And this one particular restaurant I went to, I noticed out of the corner of my eye some guy was staring at me, and it turned out to be the owner of the restaurant. And he came up to me with me. Me and a bunch of the guys at the gym were all sitting at the table, and he came up to me, and I still remember he had like an English or Australian accent, and he said to me, I could still remember his words. He says, "I'm sorry, sir, but if you continue to eat meat exclusively, I'm going to have to charge you accordingly." That's what he told me. And I looked up at him. I said, "But wait a minute. Your sign on the outside says all you can eat. Are you saying that the sign is a lie?" And he said to me, "Well, you can continue to finish today, but I would prefer that you don't come back to the restaurant." So I finished. We left. And here's the funny part of the story. The next day, I'm driving down the street past the restaurant, and I look at the sign. The sign, which one day before had said all you can eat, now said, best you can eat. Just a little story for you there. So, that about covers it, basically. I mean, it wasn't, like I say, there wasn't a lot of supplements back then, and we used what was available. Quite frankly, we actually depended more on food than supplements, and we really had no choice because there really wasn't a lot of these crazy supplements. There was no pro hormones, none of this exotic stuff that you see today. None of it existed back then. None. DHEA wasn't even on the market yet. So anyway, that's it. If you want more information, in-depth information about nutrition, exercise science, supplement science, anti-aging research, hormonal therapy, fat loss techniques that work, and all kinds of topics that you won't find anywhere else. You're not going to find it on the internet, any of these blog sites, these science sites. My newsletter is written in plain English. I've been a writer for over 40 years. I know how to write. I know how to write so that people understand. Some of these science sites, when I read it, I mean, I've been studying science for 50 years and I can't even understand it. I don't know who would be reading these blogs. They write like they're writing for other scientists. They're terribly written. But anyway, that's another story. Subscribe today to my Applied Metabolics newsletter. I absolutely promise you will learn a lot. Guaranteed, I don't care how much you know, you will learn something every month from reading my newsletter. It's 40 to 50 pages every month. It's more like a monthly ebook. It's at www.appliedmetabolics.com. And if you want to have the best friend you'll ever have, go get yourself a dog. My dog Chip, he's sitting here somewhere. He's very quiet. My dog Chip, 2 weeks ago, they found a large tumor in his stomach, and they removed it. And, he was kind of like out of it for a couple of days. He's back to normal. I don't know how much longer I'm going to have with him, but I can tell you that I will cherish every moment I have with this dog because he's been a great friend and a great companion. And any dog will do that for you too. So go to a shelter and adopt a dog. Take care.